Welcome back to another episode of the Recharge Zone podcast. I'm your host, Ann-Margaret and I'm joined by my co-host, Brent Doty. Today we have a special guest, Paul Bertetti, Director of Aquifer Science. He's going to explain a little bit about Karst, the Edwards Aquifer System, and give us a little bit of specific scientific details about where we get our main source of water.
Welcome, Paul. Would you mind telling us a little bit about your background and your role at the EAA?
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. Appreciate the time. As Ann-Margaret said, I'm currently the Director of Aquifer Science at the Edwards Aquifer Authority. The Aquifer Science Group conducts monitoring and research to understand how the aquifer works and assess the water quality in the aquifer, and essentially assess the water quality of the water going into and within and coming out of the aquifer. And also to understand how we might develop models to assess the aquifer under different conditions. Personally, I was born in San Antonio, so I've lived here almost all my life. So I have a good understanding of the community and the aquifer in general. And my background is mostly in aqueous geochemistry. And so for the past 25 years or so, I've studied the nature of aquifer chemistry and water interactions, both in the Edwards Aquifer and for other aquifers in the region.
Paul, did growing up here and being around the Edwards Aquifer your whole life, did that have any influence on you wanting to become a geoscientist or a geochemist?
A little bit. I think my primary interest in becoming a geoscientist, a geochemist, was that in the geosciences you get to assess all aspects of the Earth's environmental system, from the rocks to the soils to the water to the chemistry and atmosphere. I think there are so many things that interact, the microbiology of the system. All those things interact, and so those natural system components are what really interested me in the end, and so I really liked that. The chemistry aspect was particularly interesting to me, especially as I got older, and so I think I was aware of the aquifer when I was younger, but it's not something I specifically thought about as a kid, I don't think.
I don't know if you were aware of this, but 2021 has been designated as the International Year of Cave and Karst. So today we thought we would help celebrate this occasion by talking about the significance of Karst and asking or answering viewers' questions about it and talking about what Karst is. Some folks think that Karst is a type of rock, or others think it's as just a certain landscape. So we wanted to ask you, Paul, what is Karst and why is it an important feature?
Well, Karst is a landscape or topography. It essentially describes a topography that is formed from the dissolution of soluble rocks, like limestone or gypsum or other kinds of rocks like that. As the water dissolves the rock, it creates certain sets of features that are fairly common. And these might be things like sinkholes, caves, streams that disappear into the stream bed and then reappear downstream, has caves, underground drainage, springs. So a particular set of characteristics, all that have resulted from water dissolving the rock over time. What karst looks like at the surface can vary significantly from these sort of towering features that you might have in the provinces of South China to a very flat landscape like you see around Orlando, Florida, where it has all these sinkholes, but the surface topography is really flat. And then kind of in between is our area in the hill country and in the north of San Antonio and Medina and Uvalde County along the Balcones Fault Zone, where you have a range of hills and features, entrenched streams, sinkholes, caves, caverns, open solution fractures and faults. And so all those together define a karst topography that's really driven by water dissolving the limestone.
Can you explain a little bit about what makes the Edwards Aquifer a karst aquifer? Like, I know sometimes we hear the Carrizo Aquifer and then you hear Trinity Aquifer. So I don't know if those are karst aquifers, but what differentiates a karst aquifer from other types of aquifers, and what characteristics are unique to a karst aquifer system?
Well, I think Karst aquifer is an aquifer that it has developed through a lot of the karst features. So a lot of limestone aquifers are in fact karst aquifers. So the water over time has dissolved the rock to create these underground conduits, either along fractures or fault plains, or even between the bedding of the rock. So that water flows easily and fairly rapidly throughout the system. And that's enhanced by the caves and open sinkholes at the surface that allow water to infiltrate the aquifer fairly rapidly. The Trinity Aquifer is also a karst aquifer because it's made up primarily of limestone. It has some other layers in between that kind of limit, that are made of clay, that kind of limit the water transport through parts of the system. But mostly it's a karst aquifer as well. In fact, most aquifers that have fresh water that are made of limestone end up being karst aquifers over time. The Carrizo-Wilcox aquifer is a sand aquifer, so what we would call a porous media aquifer. And that essentially is different because now you have the sand grains kind of all as one with not a lot of open features. So water moves much more slowly in those kinds of aquifers. For instance, in the Edwards Aquifer and the Karst Aquifer, water might move on the order of thousands of feet per day, whereas in the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer, water might move a few feet per year. So quite a difference in the speed at which water migrates through the system.
And I have a quick question for you. So like a karst aquifer and a sand aquifer, does that affect the way that water can be pumped out of those aquifers?
A little bit. Sometimes in aquifers like the Carrizo-Wilcox, there might be even more variability in the ability of the aquifer to produce water because you have sand lenses that are more conductive to water and other areas that are less conductive. But generally, it's a fairly productive system. The Edwards system is a little bit more unique in that pretty much anywhere you drill, you can get good production of water in the aquifer zone and the artesian zone of the aquifer. So I think it really depends on the specific characteristics of the individual aquifers. Sometimes they don't transmit water as effectively, other times they do. So for instance, the Carrizo actually is a pretty productive aquifer and can produce wells that are as productive as any Edwards wells. So I think you can't really make a singular determination just based on the type of aquifer.
That's fascinating. I learn something new every day.
So Paul, it sounds like karst systems, and particularly the Edwards Aquifer, are very complex and dynamic. I know in the early court rulings about water regulation, they even said that groundwater was too mysterious to be well understood, to be understood enough to be regulated. So with that in mind, of course, we've learned a lot since those early cases. But what is the role of the aquifer science team in furthering that understanding towards better management and policy?
Yeah, you bring up a good point. One of the particular things about karst aquifers that's different from, say, a sandstone or a sandy aquifer, like Ann-Margaret mentioned, is that generally, as you know, water flows downhill. So even underground, water flows from areas of higher pressure or higher elevations to lower elevations, generally within the system. In a karst aquifer, because the conduits and these open fractures and perhaps fault plains control the flow of water, almost like it was an underground piping system, water may not flow exactly in the direction of the gradient. And so there are some unexpected changes in direction and unexpected pathways that we have to accommodate. Sometimes we can test those by using direct testing methods like putting dye tracers underground and looking at where the dye appears at springs or in wells to help us understand the exact flow paths. And sometimes this is really important for determining things like potential contamination from particular contamination events or spills. So those are, I think, are kind of big differences between karst and sand systems. In the sense of what we try to do every day from an aquifer science standpoint is we're try to understand how the chemistry of the aquifer varies across the region. We like to understand how it varies coming out of the springs. We're measuring water levels to understand the relationships of different parts of the aquifer to each other. So when one area is drawn down, can we see the same sorts of behaviors in another area? We like to understand how the recharge zone is linked to various parts of the aquifer to understand what areas may be more vulnerable to contamination than others. So these are all parts of specific research projects that the aquifer science team embarks upon and studies over the years.
So, Paul, since we are heading into the summer months where it seems that we experience times of drought, can you explain the importance of the index wells in Bexar County, in Uvalde County? And does the fact that the aquifer is a karst aquifer play a role in how fast or how slow the aquifer recharges or discharges?
Well, that is a complex question, and so let me answer that in parts. One, the first thing I would say is historically in our part of Texas, there's less rainfall in the summer months. And so when you combine that with higher summer temperatures, there's a high demand for water. So that in the summer levels nearly always drop significantly, even when we're not in drought. And that brings up another term. So drought isn't necessarily defined the same way by everyone. Usually it refers to dry times. But does that mean that we have dry soils? Does that mean that there's a specific deficit of rainfall? Does it mean that there's an extended period of time without rain or a length of time without recharge to the aquifer? So at the AA, our drought is typically defined as an extended period of time, usually years, in which recharge to the aquifer is much less than normal. And so the aquifer really isn't adequately refilling over time. So I wouldn't say the lack of the rain in the summer is really a drought every year, unless it's coupled with a longer term low period of rainfall. So having said that, we've had lower than expected rainfall over the last couple of years, and aquifer levels this spring are lower than they have been in the last couple of years. In fact, the Western United States is really entrenched in a longer term drought for the last 3 or 4 years now. So the index wells, both in Uvalde County and Bexar County, provide us with a measure of the overall water levels in the aquifer. Since the aquifer in Uvalde area behaves a little bit differently than it does in the rest of the region, there's a separate index well out there in the west to help us get a better gauge of what's happening. And each index well has a long history of data that's correlated to associated water use and the amount of spring flow that occurs. And water levels in the index well then are used to gauge how much water essentially is available in the aquifer. It's not exactly, but you can kind of think of it sort of like a gas gauge for the aquifer. As those water levels go down, we have to be more concerned about what kind of water is available. And as those levels go down, and we need to conserve water to ensure that there's enough availability for water to flow out of the springs, which is what we're legally required to do as part of the Edwards Aquifer Authority's mandate, is to maintain a sufficient water flow out of the springs to maintain the endangered species, but also to ensure that there's enough water for everyone in the region to use and go about their lives. So the index wells serve as a sort of this metric that we can use to say, once levels reach certain values, we can initiate conservation measures. We call them critical period management stages. And in each stage, as water levels go down, we require less pumping from permitted users. So the lesser amount of pumping helps to reduce the amount of decrease of aquifer level, especially in times when we have no rainfall or we have lower rainfall amounts. And so that helps to conserve the amount of water in the aquifer region. So the index wells themselves enable us to help to control the amount of water that's used, especially in times of drought, and also provide us a measure of how much water is available for our use in the future. I think that's all the parts of that question, but now I can't. So the last part of the question is how does the karst play a role? And I think one of the advantages of the Edwards Aquifer is that the karst features along the recharge zone, these open sinkholes and maybe conduits and fractures, allow water that from rainfall that runs off into the creeks. It allows that water to recharge the aquifer relatively rapidly. The aquifer is very efficient at filling up. And so one of the advantages that we've had over a long period of time is that even in areas when we have had droughts for a couple of years, if we get good rainfall and good water flow in the streams and creeks, then the aquifer is able to fill up relatively rapidly and sort of help us out. But a big disadvantage of that is because the water gets into the aquifer really rapidly, it has much less time to filter that water. The water that may potentially contain sediments or contaminants gets into the aquifer directly without any sort of filtration, at least at the surface. To compensate for that, folks may be familiar that they see these retention basins and other features that are constructed along next to parking lots of shopping centers all over the recharge zone, north side of Bexar County and Medina County. And those retention basins help slow the water infiltration into the aquifer, allowing some of the sediments to settle out before the water is recharged. So that's a mechanical way of trying to assess that. But that happens all over the region where we have this rapid recharge that allows the water tank to fill up fairly quickly, even after a long period of drought.
I think those are important pieces of information just for the everyday person, because I think, you hear J17 on the news and then you hear about rainfall happening, throughout our jurisdiction. But as you mentioned, it kind of has to fall in a certain place for it to be substantial recharge to the aquifer, correct?
Yeah, and that's another thing. Most of our recharge comes from water that runs off into streams and creeks, rivers, and then flows over the recharge zone. One of the things we talked about with karst aquifer features or karst landscape features are these disappearing streams, and so that's one of the reasons. If you go up to the Nueces and the Frio River and even Cibolo Creek, it might have water up in the northern parts of those streams, but then after they cross the recharge zone and to the south of the recharge zone, those streams are dry. They've lost all their water. They've essentially disappeared into the recharge zone and into the aquifer. And so that's a feature of the karst system and the major way in which the aquifer gets its water over time. So runoff into those streams flows into the aquifer through these karst features and fills up the tank. It's not the only way water gets into the aquifer. Some of the recharge occurs over the land surface, soaks into the soils and then into the ground, and is a slower process. But it may not be an insignificant part. Maybe as much as 10 or more % of the aquifer recharge comes from this slow infiltration over the landscape. And so if we're in a drought, for instance, and the soils are very dry, that part of the recharge process may not be very effective. So it helps to have good land management practices so that we can enhance the ability of the soil to retain some water and enhance that recharge over time.
So, Paul, it sounds like karst is a very important feature. Certainly millions of people worldwide depend on water from karst landscapes, including more than 2 million people here in the greater San Antonio region. So I really appreciate you taking your time today to talk to us about karst and about the Edwards Aquifer and how it works. And thank you again for coming on.
Yeah, well, thank you. I really appreciate your time, and thanks for listening.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Recharge Zone podcast. Have questions, ideas for topics, or things you would like to share with us? Well, reach out to us at rechargezone@edwardsaquifer.org.